All right, good morning. April Hathcock is the Scholarly Communications Librarian at NYU, where she educates the campus community on issues of ownership, access, and rights in the research lifecycle. Before entering librarianship, she practiced intellectual property and antitrust law for a global private firm. Her research interests include diversity and inclusion in librarianship, cultural creation and exchange, and the ways in which social and legal infrastructures benefit the works of certain groups over others. She is the author of the article White Librarianship in Blackface, Diversity Initiatives in LIS, and the blog At the Intersection, which examines issues at the intersection of feminism, libraries, social justice, and the law. Additionally, a few years ago, I had the honor of sharing the ERNL Battledix Championship with April. And that was definitely a highlight for me.
Thank you so much, Anna. that was a lot of fun at ERNL. Thank you all very much for having me here today. Can I get the slides up on this screen down here, please? And I'm seeing a red light, so the screen might not be on at all, actually. The monitor might not be on. He's coming. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak at NASIG. I'm excited about your theme this year, Racing to the Crossroads of Scholarly Communication. So let's see. I'm going to wait just a moment. Let me get the screen on. Okay, no problem. Okay, so to start, I would like for us to take just a moment to acknowledge the peoples on whose ancestral lands we have the privilege of meeting today. There are the Miyamiyaki, who are the downstream people. Today we know them by their colonial settler name as the Miami or the Miami. And the Bodewadmi, the keepers of the hearth fire. Today we know them as the Potawatomi. We meet on their lands even as they and many other indigenous nations continue to fight for the cleanliness and sanctity of our water in the face of the Dakota Access Pipeline. So I'd like us to take just a moment of silence, of gratitude and of acknowledgement for these peoples on whose land we have the privilege of meeting today. Thank you. Okay, so buenos días a todos. Vengo de un congreso en Santiago, Chile, con investigadores y estudiantes y bibliotecarios. Y ahora ya mi cerebro está en español, so I'm having a little trouble switching back into English mode. So pardon me if I sort of take a moment to think through some things or if something slips out in Spanish. Though I know yesterday when I was at the student spotlight presentations, there's at least one student here from La Universidad Autónoma de México. So at least one person, por lo menos una persona, will understand what I'm saying if I do slip into Spanish mode. But so bear with me. But as I was saying, I am fascinated by the theme of the conference this year, Racing to the Crossroads of Scholarly Communication. Because in so many ways, let's see, it's not advancing. There we go, okay. In so many ways, we are racing to the crossroads of scholarly communications in the information science sector, in libraries, in the work that we're doing. We have so many developments going on in open access, and publishing, and digital scholarship. We're doing cross-institutional work. We're even doing international collaborations. For example, this meeting that I had in Santiago, Chile with researchers there through Force 11. In particular, in libraries, we're really getting involved in publishing. We're getting involved in, working with our publishers, working with our content aggregators and vendors to sort of bring tools and services to our researchers that cover all of the different sort of levels and all of the different areas of the research lifecycle. From brainstorming ideas to initiating a literature review, to engaging in data collection or analysis, to drafting an actual, output, to the publication submission process, to finally self-archiving those final projects that come out. We're involved in all of those aspects, and we're sort of at the forefront of developing ways that researchers are doing this kind of work throughout this process. And in particular, we're crossing disciplinary boundaries even within our own work as librarians. And I think of, in particular, as a scholarly communication librarian, the work that's being done in, for example, this intersection between scholarly communication and information literacy. There was the ACRL white paper that came out a few years ago. And even just this year at IFLA in Poland, there's going to be a separate sort of concurrent session, a day-long symposium on sort of information literacy and scholarly communication and the way that those two intersect. So we're certainly racing towards this crossroads of interdisciplinarity and sort of looking at the entire research cycle, providing resources, providing services and tools to researchers across the research life cycle. But with all of this racing that we're doing, we do have to take a moment and stop and ask, who is being left behind as we race to this crossroads? Who's not making it to the crossroads with us? And of particular interest to me, I like to think about sort of where it is that we say we're racing to. So when we say we're racing to cross the crossroads, it makes me think of intersections, which in turn makes me think of intersectionality, which is a critical theory that was developed by legal scholar and Black feminist Kimberly Crenshaw, where we view identity in terms of the matrix of oppressions and privileges that exist within particular identities. The idea being that no one is one single identity, but your identity is made up of an intersection of identities, which include areas of privilege and areas of oppression simultaneously. There's a really great article. There was an interview with Kimberly Crenshaw recently, as well as on the podcast Another Round, which is a fantastic podcast. Their last edition, they did an interview with Kimberly Crenshaw, and I really recommend that you sort of look into her work. It's fascinating work. But yeah, so when I think about crossroads, I think about intersections. In particular, I'm thinking about intersectionality, which really informs all of the work that I do. My library work, my social justice work, the legal work that I do, the diversity work that I do. For me, intersectionality is really key to thinking about anything that I'm working on. Realizing that identity is made up of not just one thing, but many things. That I am, not just a Black person, but I'm also a woman. I'm a straight woman. I'm a cisgender woman. I'm highly educated. I'm upper middle class. I have areas of oppression in my life, but I also have areas of privilege. So thinking in terms of sort of this complexity of the way things layer on top of each other. So when I say, let's stop and think about as we race to the crossroads, who's not there, I think that we need to think about it in terms of that intersectional mode, right? So thinking about the ways that different identities are operating to allow people to come to the crossroads with us or not. Sort of thinking about these intersections and wondering who makes it to the intersection or who makes it to the crossroad and who's basically being held up in traffic or stuck behind a roadblock or a barrier of some way. And so in many ways, it's important for us to relate this race to the crossroads to a sort of intersection of our professional values. And so thinking in particular about the core values of librarianship, and just looking at the values that we have from ALA, from the American Libraries Association, things like access, like democracy, diversity, education and lifelong learning, intellectual freedom, public good, and social responsibility. When we look at these values, we see that these values they don't exist in a vacuum, they don't exist in a silo, but they're actually interconnected. And in many ways, they embody this idea of intersectionality. We can't have one without all of the others, and each one sort of interacts and affects the ways that we pursue the others. So for example, we can't say that we're going to pursue diversity without also thinking about the ways that we engage in social responsibility, because systemic exclusion in our society and oppression are issues that aren't going to solve themselves, right? We can't say that we're going to be socially responsible without also thinking about the ways that affects the diversity of our profession and of our services. Another example is we can't talk about intellectual freedom without also talking about access, because people can't engage in true intellectual freedom unless they have access to the resources that allow them to partake in that sort of freedom of thinking and knowing and learning. Right? So today I really want to focus on the ways that we can embody these very important values of our profession as we engage in this race to the crossroads, or to the intersection of scholarly communication. So starting with access, sort of taking a look at access in the way that it intersects with some of our other values. I've mentioned, access and intellectual freedom, the idea that you can't really have intellectual freedom without access. But there's also this intersection between access and the public good, or social responsibility. We can't say that we're engaging in a pursuit of the public good if we're not also providing access to resources and to knowledge to the public, right? If we're not engaging in this social responsibility of making information available to the public. And then in many ways, that is also related to our value of democracy, right? You can't have a democratic knowledge, or really a democratic system, without people being able to engage in intellectual freedom, without people having access to the materials to engage with the government or to engage with their society in a meaningful way. Now, bear in mind, though, when I talk about democracy, what I'm talking about is real democracy, right? So democracy where everybody is able to participate on equal footing, on equitable footing. I'm not talking about the democracy that our country was founded on, where it's based on indigenous genocide, it's based on slavery, it's based on exclusion and oppression, not that kind of democracy, but real democracy, where everyone is coming to the table, participating, everyone has a voice, and everyone is represented. In this way, I like to think about the ways that open access, in particular, when we think about access, can help with sort of bringing in this public good, bringing in this democracy, and also bringing in diversity into the ways that we provide knowledge to others. And I say can, because I don't think that open access automatically sort of opens these doors, but it has the potential to open these doors. As my friend and colleague Charlotte Rowe has written in her article on library publishing and diversity values, open access allows new voices to find their way into the disciplinary conversations, to reach new audiences, both academic and public, and impact existing and emerging fields of scholarship and practice in a transformative way. So there's a huge amount of potential there if we're very intentional about the ways that we're employing that access, that open access movement. I talked a lot about this last year, last October at the University of Kansas, at the beginning of their sort of Open Access Month celebration, in a talk called Opening Up the Margins, where I talked about the potential for open access to really bring voices from the margins into mainstream scholarship, so into sort of the mainstream of our scholarly communications system. And then, I think about some of the projects that are going on in our space, sort of in the publishing space and in the library space. In particular, Mellon is doing a lot of really interesting work. They have given a grant to the University of Arizona Press to bring back out-of-print Indigenous and Latinx studies texts as open access texts that will be available to anybody to access, to read, and to study from. And I think it's particularly important that this is happening at the University of Arizona, considering that Arizona is a state that has recently gotten rid of their ethnic studies programs in their K-12 education. And even earlier this year, they were looking to expand that ban to the university system as well. But Mellon has given the University of Arizona Press $73,000 to open up these foundational instructional texts as a part of, and it's not just about studying the other, right, but recognizing that studying the histories of indigenous peoples in Arizona, studying the histories of Latinx communities in Arizona is a part of studying Arizona history. And it's important that those texts be made open access because it's part of the heritage of everyone in the state to be able to access it, to be able to learn from it, to be able to read and to see themselves represented in these works. As the University of Arizona Libraries Dean Shan Sutton says, this project brings together several critical components of our libraries, the press and the Office of Digital Innovation and Stewardship, into one exciting project. It leverages the expertise we have in both scholarly publishing and digital innovation into one unique program that also speaks to our commitment to diversity and inclusion. So that's one example of a very intentional way of sort of breaking down barriers, breaking down roadblocks, so that everyone is coming into this crossroads of scholarly communications and knowledge together. I also think about some of the initiatives that our new Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden, has been alluding to and describing in terms of increasing digital and public access to the holdings in Library of Congress and to the Library of Congress more generally. So allowing the public to have more access to what is essentially our national library and using, sort of thinking in terms of access as our core value to, again, increase that value of democracy, increase the value of intellectual freedom, increasing that value of public good and social responsibility. But it's important, though, when we talk about access, and even when we're talking about open access, that we realize that access means more than just sort of tossing things online, right? Just because we throw something online doesn't mean that we've provided actual access to it. And I think about this in terms of the data space. Yair Thorpe, a software developer and educator in Brooklyn, wrote a really great blog post on Medium called Open for Who? In which he describes 5 criteria that he thinks we should think about when we're looking at providing open data in any of our projects. And he says that we should aim to get at least 3 of these to get a C-. Okay, so this is really like the least that you could do is to have 3 of these options. The first one is looking at, does your project have comprehensive documentation, examples, and tutorials, right? So not just tossing your data up onto some sort of open data sharing platform, but do you have documentation that comes with it? Are there materials, teaching curricula, blog posts, videos, etc., that offer context around the data so that someone unfamiliar with the project can understand why it might be important, right? So providing that context for your data. Data doesn't just sort of grow out of nowhere. The third, can a non-programmer access the data? I think this is a big one, and Yair talks a lot about this in his blog post, that very often we say that we've provided open data, but really what we've done is provided open data for people who understand how to work with data, or for people who have the technology, the infrastructure to work with very complex forms of data. Well, that's not really open, right? That's data that's open to a small particular community. There are certain people who are reaching that sort of intersection in working with that data. So can a non-programmer access the data is one of his criteria. The fourth is there documentation available in more than one language, right? So is it available in English and Spanish? Is it available in French? Is it available in German? Do you have to know English in order to access this data and understand it and analyze it? Or is the documentation available and the context available in other languages? And then finally, is your documentation and the site it's hosted on compatible with screen readers, right? Have you tested it? So if someone has a physical disability where they're not able to read your data on a regular screen, they need to use a screen reader or some other sort of assistive technology, can they still access your data? Or is your data only available to those who don't have visual impairments or don't have other types of impairments to access the data? Right, so this is one of the ways where we really sort of, when we're thinking about access, we really have to think in terms of beyond just posting online, but making it available in a way that's meaningfully accessible to others. We also see this happening in the open educational resources space as well. And in particular, I look to the work of Robin DeRosa and Maha Bailey, who are educators and open pedagogy leaders who really have been talking a lot about the ways to make open educational resources truly accessible to those who may not have the technology infrastructure or the other kinds of resources that they would need to engage with these materials. In particular, during her keynote at OER 17 earlier this year, Maha talked about 2 key questions that we have to think about when we're sort of looking at what is the accessibility of our OER to folks who may not be in our same sort of privileged situations. And one is, how many of us have been without internet access, not by choice, for several days, right? How many of us can actually say that I've been without internet access without choice, right? And then the second question is, how many of us have been without access to a physical library for several days, right? And when we ask these questions, depending on the room that you're asking it in, you may find that there aren't that many people who can say yes to one or either of those questions. And it can be very easy when you're thinking about this to think, oh, well, that's, of course, it's, and that's largely a foreign problem. There's certain parts of the world where people don't have access to the internet or they don't have access to a physical library. But even here in North America, we have communities, particularly rural communities, where people are miles away from a nearest library. They don't have access to a physical library to gain, even if something is made open access, to gain access to that materials. Or they don't have an internet connection, so they're not able to gain access to the digital materials that we're making available through our various institutions. So when we're thinking about accessibility, we have to think about those things. Think about the ways that people who don't have these sort of privileged infrastructures are able to access materials that we're making available. In particular, the work of the Foundation for Learning Equality is really important in this space because they go into areas where they don't have the technological infrastructure, and they help to build that infrastructure in those areas so that people can access open educational resources in a more meaningful way. They've been doing some really great work throughout India and in sub-Saharan Africa, using things like Raspberry Pis and other technologies that are sort of built to allow people to access materials in places where the internet connectivity isn't very strong or isn't very reliable, or places where they don't have access to a physical library where they can gain entry into these materials and these resources, right? So this is what we're talking about when we talk about access, and we talk about sort of the way it intersects with our social responsibility, with diversity, with democracy, and intellectual freedom. When we think about it, without meaningful access, essentially what we're doing is we've created a roadblock for some while we ourselves continue to race to the intersection. So you end up with access like this, where it says there's access, but you've got like just a tangle of barbed wire sort of standing in front of it, standing in the way. So moving on to another one of our professional values, democracy, democracia, and looking at the ways that it interacts with some of our other values. So we've talked about, I've talked about, again, when I say democracy, I mean real democracy. So not democracy that's, for wealthy, literate, land-owning, straight white men, but democracy that's for everyone, right? So democracy that intersects with diversity, that intersects with the public good and with social responsibility. But also, we've talked a little bit about the way that democracy intersects with intellectual freedom, right? So making sure that people have access to materials so that they can truly engage with knowledge and engage with the systems of democracy, making decisions, having that agency in society. They have to be free to learn and know, free to learn and to know in order to be able to truly decide for themselves, to decide within a democratic system. In a related way, democracy also intersects with this value of education and lifelong learning. Again, needing to have access, so bringing access in again, to education and to educational content in order to exercise our intellectual freedom and engage in our democracy. So thinking about the ways that we're democratizing research and democratizing knowledge, I've been really excited about the news from the Wellcome Trust last year, and more recently the Gates Foundation, how they're creating these public publishing portals for research that they funded, where people can publish, not just preprints, not just sort of written final reports of the work that they've done, but they can also put in their data. They can put in null results. They can talk about failed tests and experiments and work that they've done. So having this place where anybody can access sort of work that someone else has done without having to have a subscription to the final sort of written work product. So that's a way that research is becoming more democratized. The average person can find out what's happening in the world of science or in the world of some of our other disciplines. And then even within library and information science, we're working to and have been working to democratize our own research. There's our preprint server, ELIS, it's been around for over a decade. There's the more recent work that I've been working with, the LIS Scholarship Archive that we're putting up on the Open Science Framework platform as another place to store digital objects of research from library and information science. And then there's Idealist, the idealist.org, which is a platform for showcasing open access research, specifically in scholarly communications. So collecting the links to various types of research and showcasing that research so that others can read it and sort of see what's going on in the world of ScholComm. Right? All ways where, again, open, all of this is open, and these are all ways that we're democratizing research and democratizing knowledge so that people have access to the work that we're doing. There's also sort of a way of looking at democratic education for the public good, right? So bringing in another core value, the public good and social responsibility. There are open educational resource initiatives that have just sort of been proliferating everywhere. And I'm really happy to say, I was just talking to Andy Weselick this morning about this, that we're working on an initiative at NYU to really push open educational resources and affordable course content, which to me has been really exciting because for a long time there's been this assumption that, well, if a student is at NYU and they've managed to scrape together that $60,000 a year, what do they need open educational resources for? And the fact is we have so many students who aren't eating or who don't have a permanent place to live because they're barely able to afford their education. So I'm really excited that we're bringing in this, this public good sort of mentality into the work that we're doing, even on my campus, this, private, very privileged institution. We also see it in the public education space. At a campus that's right up the road from us, the CUNY campus in East Harlem, they had this project that went on in the last several years called Just Publix at 365. 365 was the number of the address. And it was a project that was spearheaded by Jesse Daniels, who's a sociology professor there, and Polly Thistlethwaite, who's the chief librarian for the library at the CUNY, the graduate center. And it was a series of open courses and workshops that was essentially meant to bring academia out to society and vice versa, bringing society into academia. So they invited activists, and as well as professors, students, just community leaders, community members to come and sort of study issues that were of relevance to their neighborhood in Eastern Harlem, which is a predominantly Latinx and Black and brown neighborhood. And it was a really great way to sort of bring the community together in this academic space, but also sort of bringing the academics of that institution together with the folks in the community and really learning together how to leverage academic research and activism, how to leverage activists and community organizing into academic research and that sort of thing. And they published a book that detailed some of the, it's called Being a Scholar in the Digital Era, and they talked about some of the details of this great project in which they write, being a scholar in the digital era means connection to the larger social world. It is now possible for scholars to connect their politically committed work to the world beyond the academy in ways that aim to make a difference. So looking beyond sort of staying in our ivory towers for those of us who work in academia and really sort of pushing that work out into society, but again, and vice versa, right? So getting larger society involved in the work that we're doing. Right. And then there's another way in which we can sort of look at how democracy and access are intersecting with intellectual freedom and social responsibility. In particular, I'm thinking about this project that De Gruyter is engaged with 5 Ivy League university presses, including Columbia, Cornell, Harvard, Princeton, and UPenn, in which they're going to provide more than 500 books and journal articles as open access on subjects such as constitutional history, dissent, truth and ethics, gender studies, immigration and human rights, climate change, among many other things, as a way to allow people, particularly in this day and age, and particularly here in the US, to engage with these subjects in a very meaningful way and to learn actual information as opposed to alternative information or fake information about some of these really important issues that are happening in our world today. As Stephen Fallon, the director of the Publishing Partner Program, writes, public debates surrounding immigration policy, climate change, international relations, and constitutional and human rights are currently at the forefront of the national discourse, especially, but not only, in the United States. Together, De Gruyter and its partners are keen to support a thoughtful and informed debate on these sensitive and serious issues. So they're really sort of leveraging that access as well as this education and lifelong learning to build democracy in a way that everyone is able to engage in intellectual freedom, to engage in sort of gathering knowledge so they can participate in the debate, make well-reasoned decisions about what's happening in our world today. And again, it's about sort of, when we talk about sort of meeting at that intersection, it's about making sure that everyone's there on an equal footing. So it's not just the person who has access to these particular resources behind this paywall, or the people who have access to this particular institution, but anybody who can have access to this knowledge and be able to learn from it and engage in the debate in a free and open way. All right, finally looking at our core value of diversity and the ways that it interacts with some of the other values. Now, to me, because this is part of my own personal research and the work that I do, it is sort of one of the most important and pressing values. And I think that in a lot of ways we can accomplish so much more with our other values through this particular value of diversity. If we're looking to provide more diverse perspectives in our profession, in our work, in our services, and our resources and collections, we can also help to build democracy. We can also help to build social responsibility. We can build intellectual freedom. We can build access when we have all of these different perspectives that are at play. In particular, I look at our profession, which is, for example, it's 87% white, and it's even worse in other forms of diversity that we even bother to measure when it comes to people who have disabilities, when it comes to people who come from lower economic backgrounds. We really are a profession that is very homogeneous. And so there are a lot of ways that we can really build diversity into the work that we're doing to sort of correlate with some of these other values that we have. In particular, in scholarly communication, though, it's important for us to think about whose voices are being heard, right? So who is actually communicating? Who are the scholars that we're hearing from? Who has access to this work that we're making available? Who is at the forefront of democracy? Who's participating in these debates? Who has the intellectual freedom? We talk about public good. Public good for who? Who is the public? Who are we talking about here? Lifelong education for whom? Do you have to be able to afford it? Do you have to be in a particular position to be able to access it? When we fail to engage with these really important, very critical questions, we end up with things like this, for example. Recently, the Journal of Political Philosophy released a special Black Lives Matter issue of their journal in which not a single author was a Black person. It wasn't intentional, right? But still, that's a huge part of the problem, that it never occurred to them, yes, Black Lives Matter, but in what context? Do they only matter when other researchers are researching them from a very distant and a very observant way? Or do they matter in the sense that there's agency and there's a voice there for people to communicate about what's happening in their own communities, in their own experiences, and to leverage that through their research, right? They've since apologized, and they're working to try to rectify that, but the fact that it never even occurred to them that, maybe we should have some representation here in this issue of our journal, or in all the issues of our journal, is particularly telling. We also end up with, on a global scale, we end up with a lack of diversity. I love to pull out this map that my friend and colleague Juan Pablo Alperin from Simon Fraser University created it's a map of the web of science citations of research based on sort of how many citations come from where. And you look, like the Asian continent, the largest continent both in size and in population, is like shriveled, right? You look at the African continent, the second largest in size and population, completely shriveled. They're doing science. Science is happening in Asia. Science is happening on the African continent. Why are we not seeing that? And then to the extent that we're relying on resources like this as our sole means of sort of communicating to researchers, here is where to find research, we're missing out on so many voices. We're missing out on so much of the research that is happening out there. And yes, quality research, right? And not everything that comes out of Africa or the Asian continent is predatory. And that's a whole other talk I could give for a whole other day. But so really sort of thinking about where we're getting these resources, where we're pointing researchers to, how we're cataloging those resources, how we're creating the metadata for those resources, how are researchers able to find it and access it, so that we we can make sure that everyone is sort of reaching into that, or reaching that crossroads of scholarly communication, participating in the scholarly communication. Right? And then another example is, again, the work that Charlotte Rowe has done in terms of library publishing and diversity values, where she's looked at some of the racial and gender and other inequities in the publishing world. So for example, in the top economics journals, you know, the vast majority, of say like 90% of their articles are about the economy in the developed world, right? And even researchers that are publishing from developing nations have to sort of rework their research in a way that's going to be relevant to either North America or Europe, right? So they're not able, you know, a Malawian researcher is not able to write about what it means to engage in economic practice in Malawi and their developing economy, because that's not going to be what's important in the top economics journals. That's a shame. We're missing out on some of the diversity that we can find in some of our research because we're valuing certain voices and certain perspectives over others, right? But it's not all bad news, right? There are ways that we can bring diversity into the intersectional mix of the work that we're doing. For example, there's, again, Mellon doing great work. They provided a grant to the Association of American University Presses. In particular, they're working with 4 university presses, MIT, Duke, the University of Georgia, and the University of Washington, to fund diversity fellowships for early career people who are entering academic publishing. And so it's going to be diverse, so it's going to be fellowships for people to come in and to sort of get an inroads into academic publishing, to get started into academic publishing, to help diversify the pipeline there. We also have diversity residency and scholarship programs in librarianship through ARL, the Association of Research Libraries, ACRL, the Association of College and Research Libraries, through the American Libraries Association. So there's the Mosaic program that's in partnership with the Society of American Archivists for people looking to go into archival work. There's the Spectrum Scholarship through ALA for people from underrepresented communities who want to become librarians. And then there's the Diversity Alliance with ACRL, which is getting institutions to commit to bring on a diversity fellow to work who's interested in academic librarianship. On a more global scale, there's work that I've been doing with Force 11. Force is an organization, is international organization for the future of research communication and e-scholarship. They were the ones who hosted this workshop that I went to in Chile. And we have, in particular, we've been working on something called the Scholarly Commons. So really sort of looking at a global way of promoting sort of principles of open scholarship. And really making sure that it's inclusive in the way that we talk about these things. So we had the meeting in Chile. We have other meetings that are coming up that we're hoping to do in the following years. We've got some grant funding for that. So again, really making sure that we're bringing diverse and global perspectives into the work that we're doing when we start thinking about research communication, scholarly communication. And then there's the work that the University of Kansas has been doing that sort of sprung from their open access festivities last year, where they had a symposium on open access sort of beyond APCs, beyond author processing charges, and really thinking about how can we sort of leverage open access in a way that's going to be more equitable, including for researchers who may not have an institution, or researchers who are at less privileged or less resourced institutions who may not be able to afford to participate in that traditional way. So really sort of looking and learning globally. From that work, several librarians and researchers from the University of Kansas have started a blog, the OA Anarchy blog. It's written by Josh Bolek, Ada Emmett, Mark Greenberg, Town Peterson, and Brian Rosenblum. And so they're sort of continuing the conversations that we started at the symposium last year, as well as there's a space on Humanities Commons, which is again, an open access public platform for sharing ideas and research in the humanities. And that's another space where we've been continuing these conversations about building open access in a more globally inclusive, in a more diverse way, and looking at it beyond sort of just what's available to those who come from more resourced institutions or areas. Essentially, it's important for us to realize that racing to the intersection really means nothing if when we get there, we look around, we see all of the same faces, and we realize we've all come from the same places, right? We've all sort of taken the same road to the intersection. What's the point in being in the intersection if we've all taken the same route to get there? When we can build diversity into the work that we're doing as based on our core values, we can really build in some of our other core values like access, like intellectual freedom, like lifelong learning and public good, so that we're able to build democracy and build sort of this open knowledge and open research for all. So moving forward, it's important to stop and sort of think about who's there, who's not there, who's showing up, or who's able to show up and not show up. But we are able to move forward, right? We still move forward. But even as we do so, we have to continue to look around and even look back sometimes and see who's not made it there, right? Who's stuck in traffic, who's stuck behind a roadblock, who's come up against a barrier. We have to be willing to pick people up along the way, to stop and help remove roadblocks. Yes, it'll involve picking up some hitchhikers. Yes, it'll involve sort of doing some ride share. But that's a part of what it means to race into these crossroads, right? In a way that's going to be representative of everyone who's involved. It's also important as we move forward to not be afraid to explore detours, right? It can be a very colonial way of thinking and knowing to think of knowledge or to think of progress as being this straight line. But sometimes it's about the journey, and the journey is kind of squiggly. It might curl back on itself. It might veer off in this totally unexpected direction, all in the process of sort of generally moving forward, right? So taking a very decolonizing the way that we think about progress and sort of moving forward in a way that also involves detours and will involve sort of going off the beaten path, so to speak. But ultimately realizing that there is no one path to this crossroad, right? That we shouldn't expect everyone to come down the same road or the same route. But in many ways, it's all connected, looking at it in that intersectional way. It is all connected to our professional values if we think about it in terms of access, in terms of intellectual freedom, democracy, lifelong learning and education, and most of all, diversity. So that as we race to the crossroads, we're ensuring that as few people as possible are left behind, and we're all moving forward together. Thank you. So I'd be happy to take questions and conversation, and I'm going to rely on Anna to find people because I can't see you.
Please remember to give your name and your institution.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth McDonald from the University of Memphis.
Hi.
How do we reconcile blind peer review in academic journals and increasing diversity?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, I will say that more and more disciplines are looking at open peer review as an option, or at least opening a portion of peer review. Maybe they'll still have the traditional sort of closed peer review, but also having a way of doing more open peer review and actually publishing the reviewers' comments along with that. But I think, part of what it takes is looking at individual bias and looking at sort of the individual context of the researcher who's doing the reading. So part of it is sort of looking at knowing exactly who that author is across from you and knowing sort of where they're coming from and that they're coming from a diverse perspective. But also part of it is being able to look for within the research itself a more diverse perspective. So as you're reading a work, whether you know who the author is or not, is someone who's combined research that comes from different places, different areas, voices that are cited here that aren't the usual voices that you're always hearing from. So I think there are certainly ways to sort of look for diversity and look for a diverse perspective, even when you don't know who the individual author is. And then part of that work also happens before you even get to the peer review stage, right? So actually doing some sort of recruitment for authors in more diverse areas or with more diverse perspectives, to invite authors to come and contribute a piece that'll be peer reviewed, and making sure that you have more people who come from more diverse backgrounds and perspectives who are actually feeding into the research that's being reviewed to begin with.
Hello, Emily Ray. I'm at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. I was at a meeting recently for Arkansas academic librarians, and we were talking about sort of pushing OER and encouraging it. And one of the librarians said, have we forgotten about the digital divide? Do we not talk about that anymore? Mm-hmm. I don't think a lot of our students have access to computers or strong internet at home. And we were sort of thinking about that, and I don't have any data, but I feel like that's kind of accurate for a lot of our students.
Yeah.
How should we be thinking about that? How should we be factoring that in? You know, for purchasing more ebooks because it's cheaper for us and for our online students. What is the impact? Like how should we be thinking about this if we're factoring it in? If we're considering more OER resources. I'm interested in any suggestions about how we should be, I don't know, adding that in as a factor.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's great that you've started that conversation already, sort of thinking about, you know, as we do OER work and as we're doing this outreach, it isn't just about making it available online, but we do have to think about our students who don't have that access. In particular, Robin DeRosa that I mentioned earlier has really been doing a lot of great work in this space. And I mean, some of it comes down to just making these things available in print, right? So it may not be totally free in the ways that we think about OER. There may be a small cost associated, and that's something you could think about in terms of, you know, is this something we can subsidize for students who need it? But making things that are available through print that students can come and pick up and have access to. So when they go home to a place that doesn't have reliable internet connectivity, they can still access the course materials that are there. When you're working with faculty members to develop course materials, sort of making sure that they're thinking about those issues as well. So, you know, letting them know, hey, if you're going to have a video module for this, make sure it's something that can be easily downloaded to and watched on a smartphone, you know, if someone has it, or a tablet that we can lend out through the library, or, you know, make sure you have some sort of textual transcript that someone can print out and take home if they're not able to access it online. I think the start is to really build that awareness and to start thinking about what are the needs of these students who don't have access to this technology, and how can we make it easier for them to access these resources while still being able to work in the OER space.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Hi, April. I'm Bob Boise from Springer Nature, and I wanted to compliment you on your quote from my friend Steve Fallon at De Gruyter, and just to say that I think that your approach with, you know, offering maybe a carrot to the publishers that do progressive things and go down the OA road is nice, because we're very used to getting the stick, you know, for the paywall and all that embargo stuff. But if more carrots were offered, we might actually get there faster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Susan Wisniewski at Northwestern University, Feinberg School of Medicine. That last question, that earlier question about the students who don't have access, maybe caught you unprepared, because you left out the next step. What you said was the first step, but from your own presentation, the next step would be to reach out, to publicize, the press, the community, you know, get involved to try and improve access for those families.
Right. I mean, she was talking specifically. She specifically asked, "How do we get started?"
That would be the start.
So I told her how to get started. So no, I didn't leave anything out. I said what I meant to say, but yeah, you're right. I mean, as I said in my presentation, that's another way that we can do that with the, you know, building the resources that we have. And maybe it's something that you're able to do just within your library. Maybe not. Maybe it's a broader institutional work, is to sort of reach out to the community and build that infrastructure in the community. Which is great, but of course that takes time. So in the meantime, the students who are here,
it's not a sure thing, of
right,
course,
who don't have that access.
I want to remind people of that part as well.
Well, you did, so there you go.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Ted Westervelt, Library of Congress. I work on digital preservation, and your presentation reminds me a little bit of one I saw at iPres a couple years ago, which was largely about the creation of work in what I'll call marginalized communities, and how they aren't being preserved, and now we're into a digital world. And it was a very exciting presentation, and it got me thinking about things, but it was hard to dig into it. And one thing that I had been thinking about and I've thought about, but I've had a hard time getting going with, is I'd say scholarly communication outside the sort of peer-reviewed work. I like to think that scholarly communication doesn't necessarily have to be simply through the wonderful peer-reviewed journals and things like
Absolutely.
this. It's also part of what we call the published heritage, which is also the responsibility of the Library of Congress. But one thing that I was thinking at the time was that we are missing a large part of the creative output, which is just a great loss to us all, scholars and people and patrons of all sorts. And one thing that I was interested in was there some way we could do, speaking from a digital preservation perspective, could we do outreach to these communities telling them, if you create in this way, we'll be more likely to preserve it, and then the more ambitious, and I really can't speak entirely on behalf of my institution, what I'd like to see my institution do is that we go out and say, okay, if you do it this way, give it to us, we'll preserve it for you.
Right.
And then whatever, we can be the place that ensures, because part of what I worry about is that we create things and they're accessible now, but for God's sakes, we got to make sure it lasts and continues to be So I guess my sort of question is rambling, but do you have any suggestions on ways we could do outreach? Or it's almost, if I could reach out certain places or people to contact to follow up on this, it would be easier to get traction to, we've got sort of the knowledge base, I think, about what you can do to create stuff which will last, and then that will make it easier for us to reach out and pull the stuff in and ensure that this material, which doesn't get the benefit of large multinational corporations, will last, and so scholars and readers and just patrons and students for centuries can still have access to it. So I guess I'm just asking for help.
Right. No, absolutely. You bring up a lot of really great points. I was part of the planning committee for an unconference at Rutgers in May, and it's called the Untold Histories Unconference, where we bring together librarians and archivists, as well as community members and historians and students. And we're talking about sort of how do we not only make available this cultural heritage that's created in marginalized communities, but also sort of preserving it and providing sort of a lasting, sustainable infrastructure for it. And I think, you really touched on the key there, which is sort of creating these partnerships and creating this communication. It's about more than sort of parachuting into a community and saying, we'll take all your stuff and put it up in NYU where, you can't get in because we've got security at the door. But actually like partnering with these communities to say, to the extent that you are interested in having your materials preserved, we can work with you to do that. We can work with you, we can help from our institutional perspective, or we can just provide training or whatever it is. But it really is about creating those partnerships and those relationships. And I think a really, really great example of organizations that are doing that well is Mukurtu, just M-U-K-U-R-T-U, and Local Contexts. What they do is they work primarily with indigenous communities to help them digitize their cultural heritage and then make it available in ways that make sense for them. So providing access in ways that make sense in their local context. So they have traditional knowledge labels or things that are, only supposed to be accessed by women or only supposed to be accessed during a particular season or that sort of thing. And so helping them to, Mukurtu is the platform and then Local Context is the labeling system, allowing them to digitize their cultural heritage and make it available within their community, but then also to the extent that they're willing and able to make it available to researchers beyond their community as well. So, and they've been partnering with local universities and other institutions to sort of do some of this digitization work, do some of this labeling work. So really, I think it's that partnership. It's those of us who have institutions where we have sort of the resources available, reaching out to those communities. And part of the inroads we can use is sort of reaching out to researchers who are already working in those communities or any sort of contacts we have within those communities to say, we're here if you want to talk about ways that you can preserve your cultural work. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, I'm Erin Peters from Denison University in Ohio. I wanted to thank you for pointing out the lack of scholarly research coming out of Asia and Africa. I lived in South Korea for a couple of years, and I'm trying to continue some of my research now that I'm back home. My Korean skills are not good enough for a lot of academic research. So how would you address kind of that language barrier if we want to access the research coming out of those continents?
Oh, that's a great question. Again, and I don't, this is also a huge, intersectionality is a huge thing for me. Partnerships is another huge thing for me. Relationships, I think it really comes down to that. So finding researchers in Korea that you can partner with, who'd be willing to work with you to sort of help you access some of those materials, to find ways to find translated materials or find translation tools that work well for Korean language and for Korean characters so that you can access that research. One thing that I've really benefited from in doing my work with Force 11 has been sort of being able to partner with researchers in different parts of the world and being able to sort of see those possibilities for engaging in research and moving forward in research in that way. So I would absolutely say start at the people level. And find sort of looking for those partnerships, looking for those relationships based on people you knew while you were there and while you'd started working, and sort of seeing how to continue that to sort of bridge the language gap and other gaps that may exist for you as well in continuing your research.
We have plenty of time if you have more questions. Well, I actually have something that I've been thinking about. Anna Creech, University of Richmond. So I'm in charge of managing our collections budget. And every year I'm taking a look at, what are the resources we have? How are they being used? Is there still evidence that this is relevant to our collection? And so I'm thinking about, okay, I really want to make sure that we have all of the research out there in the world that's relevant to what our faculty are teaching and what they're researching themselves. But I can't see myself finding the justification to subscribing to, the Ghanaian Journal of Economics.
Right.
Because we don't really have anybody who's looking at that right now. And we don't have anybody who's teaching that right now. So what I would rather see is somebody who is writing about Ghanaian economics getting published in, whatever the main economic, journals that are put out there by the publishers that we work with already. So what can we do when we're not necessarily, my institution is not an R1. We're not collecting everything in the world. We're collecting things to support the curriculum. What can we do in those kind of places to encourage the inclusion of research like that when we're not necessarily the ones that are going to buy something specifically that way?
Right. That's a great question, Anna, because we're working with finite resources. I mean, we can't buy everything that comes out in the world. But I think part of what we can do is pointing our researchers to where they can find information about these resources. So, for example, on the African continent, they have been indexing their journals and creating sort of like a Pan-African index of scholarly journals. So that's, one place, sort of having that available, making that available to researchers and saying, hey, you do research in economics, have you checked out what's in this, this African index, or have you looked in Latina index for Latin America? Have you sort of taken a look at some of the work that's happening in other places? So, pointing them to that, and to the extent that we work directly with faculty, those of us who do, any sort of liaison work or information literacy work. But then even, for those of us who are just, we work in knowledge management, and, part of that is sort of making sure that those indexes are there and available in our resources, so that researchers can find them and see, oh, here's a place where I can look to see, what are some of the main journals in my discipline in this part of the world or that part of the world. And then, then they can sort of go through the process of finding the actual articles or accessing the actual resources. But it doesn't have to be that we sort of, because that actually doesn't work either. I buy the stuff and they will come, right? That's not necessarily going to be effective. But if we can point them to where they can find those resources, and also sort of gently encourage them to think about, again, those partnerships. As you read this work that's happening in the Ghanaian Journal of Economics, maybe that'll spark a partnership with a researcher in Ghana in your discipline where you want to actually sort of co-author or work together and see the work sort of not only within their being published within their context, but also being published here within our context as well.
Thank you. I was hoping you'd say something like that.
Okay, good.
Anybody else? Yes. Oh.
Okay.
Thanks. So I'm Chris Bullock at Cal State Northridge. I'm especially thinking about the Web of Science piece and whether you think it would be more productive to try to work with Clarivate Analytics now on trying to democratize that index, or trying to work around it and just emphasize things like CALO and other global sources over it, or just try both approaches and hope you kind of meet in the middle at some point?
That's a great question, and that, to me, and it sort of relates to what a colleague from Springer was talking about in terms of, you know, providing the carrot and not just stick to publishers. Personally, I struggle with this all the time. It's to sort of, you know, do we work on this apart from the publisher, you know, the big publishers that we're paying, and say, you know, forget you guys, we're going to build this on our own and you know, make it free or open or whatever, and sort of build our own system? Or do we entirely work within the system that we have, and sort of look to them to develop it? Or do we do both? And I think that we do both, right? We continue to work with our publishers and our vendors, continue to work within the system that we have. Because we realize they're businesses and they're looking to make money, and we, you know, want to democratize things and make them a little more free. So, but finding the common ground that we have and working with them, but then also, to the extent that we can with our finite resources, working together apart from them to build sort of the infrastructure and build the resources we have, and to emphasize resources that already exist. Like, for example, you mentioned Cielo, because I think a lot of times, particularly here in North America, when we start thinking about democratizing knowledge, we think about open access, we act like this is a brand new thing because it's something that we're just now like struggling with. Whereas, you know, for example, in Latin America, they've had open access for decades without APCs, right? They've been doing this for a long time. So, yeah, it's part of it is sort of looking to see what makes sense here in our context and working with our publishers and continuing with those partnerships that we already have. But then also part of it is sort of looking to what's already out there and building things on our own as well, so that we have that combination of things. I think is a good way to go about it. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Christy Degner from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Health Sciences Library. And I've been thinking about how, you know, the Web of Science and the scholarship that's coming from all over the world. Mm-hmm. And at my institution, where librarians are increasingly involved in working with research teams doing systematic reviews, which turn up thousands of articles that need to be screened for relevancy to the research question being investigated. And so far, the library staff have often been in the role of taking the full text requests and looking at them and realizing that some of them are for non-English articles, or maybe, you know, and so for them. Now I'm wondering if the research question is turning up a significant amount of non-English article content. Should that research team consider bringing in somebody who can evaluate that content, instead of us saying to them, we can get this for you, but we're telling you that it's not in English. Do you still want it? And often they're saying,
right,
no.
No.
No. So I'm just trying to rethink and interested in any thoughts you have. Thank you.
No, that's a great question, and I think that, you know, again, it's not like you can bring in translator every time you get something that's not in English, but I think that you make a good point when you say that if a particular research question is yielding a lot of results in another language, like you say you're looking at something in bioinformatics, and all of a sudden you're getting all of these resources that are in Mandarin. Maybe it is worth it to sort of look into bringing in someone who can read Mandarin and sort of look through some of those abstracts and let you know, like, oh, what are they doing over in China in this area, in this field? What's happening there, and how might that be relevant to the research that's being done here? So looking at it at scale and seeing, if you see a preponderance of resources in a particular language, why not sort of add that as part of sort of the grant, is sort of hiring someone who can come in and translate some of the abstracts, or at least look through some of the resources and see what's being said there, because otherwise these researchers are essentially sort of tossing out a lot of this research that may be very relevant to the work they're doing just because it's in a language they don't read.
Hi, Jason Bozar, University of South Florida. Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. You talked about the public good, and I'm wondering how we could address the problem of, at the best, a vocal minority of people who are completely distrustful of academia. Because I'm particularly thinking of my father-in-law, who he would probably think that since you work at NYU, you work at a Clockwork Orange brainwashing facility,
Yes.
and just wouldn't trust anything. So how can we, and I think that's something that seriously should be addressed, because they're kind of wielding some political power in the country. So
right.
do you have any ideas about that?
It's a great question. You know, that's part of the reason why I like projects like the Just Publics project that they did at the City University of New York at CUNY, because it was sort of breaking down that ivory tower, breaking down those walls, and bringing people from the community, bringing people from the community into the academic space and vice versa, and really getting them talking about what's relevant in their particular areas, so that they could see, like, oh, these people aren't, just academic automatons, but they're actually, they're thinking people, and they, have experiences and that sort of thing. I really think that it comes down to the extent to which we can sort of break down some of those walls and those barriers through communication, through outreach, through partnership. Again, the partnership, the relationships. And it's, for someone like your father-in-law, it may be a matter of sort of heading to the public library and being able to sort of go to a session or a workshop that talks about, something that may be happening at the University of South Florida or at St. Petersburg College, where it sort of brings together people from the community as well as, people from academia. I used to work at St. Petersburg College, so one of the things that I loved about them is that there are few of the campus. St. Petersburg College is a college in the Tampa area. It used to be a community college and still operates a lot like a community college. Anyways, they have several of their campus libraries they also function as a public library, which I think is a perfect space to sort of invite people like your father-in-law and anyone else to come in and say, hey, hear about what this faculty member is working on, or hear about what this community member is working on, and getting sort of the academic people and the people who are distrustful of academics in the same place in sort of a neutral space, right? Because it's a public library as well as the academic library, to sort of talk through issues and talk through sort of their thoughts and experiences and that sort of thing. Yeah, but definitely it's, when you're dealing with someone who lacks trust, the key is to build trust, and the way you do that is through relationships. Like there's no infographic that's going to do it. There's no LibGuide that's going to do it. Everyone cries a tear because we love our LibGuides, but right, but it's just, we have to build the relationships. We have to put in the effort and the time to really do the outreach and build the relationships.
Hi, April. That was great. I'm Amber Billy. I'm at Columbia University. And when you talked about intellectual freedom and access to information, my mind immediately went to metadata, because that's what I do. And you talked about how our profession is primarily white. I would argue that even more white is technical services. And we, of course, work in systems of colonial oppression that have been codified in our classification systems and in our subject headings. And while a lot of work has been done, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to improve that. So I'm just curious on your thoughts on what we can do to improve access to information while working within these systems, or struggling against these systems, or adopting new systems.
Right. And FYI, everyone, this is a conversation that Billy and I have all the time. So this is not a new conversation. And I think part of what it is that we continue to do the work that you and several others are doing in pointing out the ways in which these systems are flawed. So even as you work within the systems, sort of pointing out, these are the ways that we still have these very problematic subject headings. We still have these very problematic metadata schema. We still are using very antiquated or very oppressive terminologies to refer to peoples, to refer to groups, to refer to concepts. So being very vocal about that and pointing that out, continuing to sort of reach out to the powers that be, like in the Library of Congress and elsewhere, to sort of make those changes. But even as we wait for that slow wheel to grind, making sure that we're being very open about what those flaws and what those problems are within our own community, our library community, and then broader to our user communities as well. And letting them know, like this, yes, this is problematic, but this is, part of the system and it's problematic. We're working to change it, but in the meantime, know that this is what's going on. In particular, I think about work that I was doing with sort of a pre-college student last summer. We have a pre-college program that happens at NYU every summer, and I was working with the student to sort of dive into an academic database for the first time. And she wanted to look up, she was a Black woman who wanted to look up information about, Black beauty and aspects of sort of, of beauty and looks and fashion stuff in Black culture. And as she was going, I was teaching them about subject headings, and as she was looking, she said, this says Negro. Like, why is this here? Why is this one of the words that's in here? And Billy's nodding because we've talked about this. And I said, I took a deep breath. Okay. And then I explained to her, like, we still have some of these very antiquated terms that are used to catalog or used to describe some of these resources. So unfortunately, for you to do your research, you're going to have to think about the ways that those terms are set up. But luckily, you have librarians. We're here. We can help you sort of wade through the morass of that oppressive terminology to find what you're really looking for. Of course, this was after she did a search for Black beauty and got, horse stuff, right? A bunch of horse stuff. She's like, I don't want anything about horses. So yeah, making sure that our researchers are aware of what's happening, even as we continue to fight and push to really improve the terminologies that we use.
All right, we have time for one more question. Does anybody have anything else? I have a question then.
Okay.
What is one thing that a membership organization like NASIG could do to improve the diversity of our organization?
Good question, Anna. I think you're doing a lot of really great things already that I think you could continue to do and do even more. Like the student scholarships that you offer. I loved that. I love that you provide free membership for students, and that you brought in this Ava, the student from Mexico. So offering maybe more of those for students who come from underrepresented backgrounds. And breaking down some of those barriers, those obstacles that people have to being able to participate in our professional organizations. I think providing the free membership and providing those scholarships, those travel scholarships, are already a huge thing, because I think that's a huge barrier, and not just for students, but even for professionals as well. Being able to find the funding to participate in our professional organizations is really a challenge. So I think that's a huge part of it. And then continuing to have programs and continuing to do work that touches on diversity. It doesn't have to be like, oh, we're going to have our diversity panel, but to the extent that you let people know this diversity is one of our core values, and it's something that's important to us within the organization. So when we get together to talk about metadata standards, or when we get together to talk about cataloging or this or that or the other, that's something that we're also thinking about, because it's a commitment that we have. And then one other thing, and this might seem totally random, but I was really encouraged when I saw your message come out from your board right after the election about NASIG's commitment to diversity and inclusion, and continued commitment to diversity and inclusion. And this was at a time with, I'm an ALA counselor, and did my work in ALA. We were having a huge kerfuffle about not having a message like that coming out from ALA. But to see something like that come out from NASIG and some of the other more specialized organizations, that really sort of said something to me as someone who's not a member. And I'm sure it said something to many others who aren't members or thinking of being members, that this is an organization that's committed to these principles. It's not just something that they say, but it's really serious to them. I think those little things like that make a huge difference.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.